Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, welcome to the session, a tour of McDonnell Space Hangar at NASA's Udvar Hazy Center. My name is Michael J. Neufeld. I'm a senior curator in the Space History Department at the National Air and Space Museum of the Smithsonian Institution. And I welcome any questions you have. Questions at the end should be put in the question should be put in the Q&A function in this platform. And when we get to the end of the talk, maybe 3/4 of an hour, then I will answer questions. I mean, I'm also willing to answer questions on a wider area of space history. Some of you may know that I published a biography of Werner von Braun, and I'm the curator for early rockets and missiles up to 1945, and also the curator for the Mercury and Gemini programs at the Air and Space Museum, among other things. So, of course, the National Air and Space Museum, many of you have been to us and visited us, or you may know about us, but the museum has two public sites. The National Mall building on the left, as it used to appear, because at the end I'm going to talk a bit about how we are renovating and redoing that building, even though it's not the topic of the talk as such. And the Stephen Udvar Hazy Center is the one that's near Dulles Airport in Chantilly, Virginia. It's actually on the Dulles Airport property, but you do not access it through the airport. It's off Route 28 in Chantilly, Virginia. That has been completely open through much of the pandemic. There were some interruptions. The Downtown Museum, we have simultaneously had longer interruptions because of the pandemic and then because of the construction that's going on. But part of the building is now open, as I will discuss at the very end. Now, I've written a bit about the history of the museum. I edited a coffee table book about the history of the museum called the National Geographic did, called National Air and Space Museum, an autobiography. So just let me give you a little backdrop, a little background information about who we are. So even though the building, the Air and Space Museum building on the mall was opened on July 1, 1976, the museum did not start then. In fact, on paper at least, the National Air Museum was created in 1946 by Congress, and in 1966 the title "and Space" was added. So, and the history of the Smithsonian as a museum, as an aeronautical museum, goes back decades before that. So if you go back to the Smithsonian as it once was in the early 20th century, which was largely the Castle building and and what later was called the Arts and Industries building, the National Museum building, we had a few airplanes. After World War I, there was a so-called temporary building that stayed up until the 1970s, called the Aircraft Building behind the castle. And so there were aeronautical collections going back to before World War I. And these aeronautical collections added the spirit of Lindbergh's Spirit of St. Louis, and in 1928, after he flew the Atlantic in 1927, in the Arts and Industries building, and some other aircraft and parts and so forth in the old aircraft building. So we got the name National Air Museum in 1946, but until for 30 more years, there was no dedicated building to the air, other than the old temporary building behind the castle. And so the National Air and Space Museum existed in the 60s and the 50s, 60s, and into the 70s, but most people didn't even sort of recognize the existence of the place to some extent until we were opening on the mall in 1976. The Udvar Hazy Center was created for or was opened for the 100th anniversary of the Wright brothers in 2003. It and it was named for Stephen Udvar Hazy, as you can see from the slide. He is a philanthropist and who made his money leasing airliners, International Lease Finance Corporation, and then he sold that, and now he has another company. But he provided the major donation that helped us get started with this concept. But the idea of having a second place actually goes back a long ways. It goes back into the 1970s, because as soon as the building downtown is open, it's clear that we don't have the room to show some very large things. And we could use more space, certainly storage. The only storage we had was in an old facility we call the Garber facility in Suitland, Maryland area, which is still in existence. Our storage, and that facility was inadequate, and so the idea was we should build a extension at an airport. This would allow us to bring aircraft in. Some aircraft would fly in, and which is actually did happen at the Udvar Hazy Center. The Boeing aviation hangar is the major part of this. I will show a map in a second of what it looks of overview and a couple of images of that. In this talk, I'm going to focus on the McDonnell space hangar, and particularly on the rocket section. Obviously, it makes sense for NAR that we focus on the rocketry dimensions of what's at the Udvar Hazy Center, but it is much bigger than simply the space hangar that I'm going to focus on. The anchor artifacts include the SR-71 Mach 3 spy plane, the B-29 Enola Gay, the Concorde, the prototype of the 707, and actually a couple hundred other aircraft. The McDonnell space hangar was on the back side of that. Maybe I should advance the slide for a second here. You can sort of see up on the top here of this map that the space hangar is appended to the aviation hangar. There's kind of, as you come in the main entrance below, you can see there's a sight line directly as you come out to the overlook from the SR-71 into the Space Shuttle Discovery that's in the space hangar. We actually designed the space hangar around the size of the space shuttle, to accommodate the space shuttle. That's because we had the atmospheric flight test orbiter Enterprise, which never went into space. We got that back in the 1980s, and it was sitting in a hangar on the Dulles Airport property for decades with a lack of place to put it. And so we designed the thing to incorporate the shuttle in the center. In fact, the back of the space hangar has a slot that where for the tail to come through, so that there are panels that can be pulled out on that one time, well, actually two times, because we first brought the Enterprise into the hangar when it opened in 2004. Then we then had exchanged orbiters. So when the end of the shuttle program came in 2011, and the NASA had to distribute the surviving shuttles, we made our choice to have Discovery. We sort of, as a Smithsonian Air and Space Museum, we had kind of the pride of place, or at least the claim on the most important one. And I'll say a little more about Discovery in a minute. So we got Discovery. It came in 2012 and replaced the Enterprise, which was then moved by the Boeing 747 shuttle carrier aircraft to New York City area, where it is now on the USS Intrepid, on the Manhattan waterfront, on the west side of Manhattan. We continued actually to build out the Udvar Hazy Center. The Mary Baker Engen restoration hangar was completed, and that's up on this sort of upper middle left of the space hangar. There is an overlook that you can look into the restoration hangar, see some of the things that are going on there. From the second floor balcony around the two sides of the restoration hangar. And that is actually, there's a lot of stuff going on right now because, notably because we are trying to restore artifacts for the downtown museum as we go through this massive overhaul. In fact, I was there today because I had to look in on the restoration of our German V2 rocket. The German V2 rocket is in the downtown museum, was taken down as part of the reconstruction of the building, and is currently being restored. It will not come back to the white scheme it was before, in a green camouflage scheme, which more accurately represents the kind of combat missile that this thing was. It wasn't a space artifact, although it, the V2 was the first human object to go into space. It was designed to kill people and bomb cities, and the Nazis used it to attack London and Antwerp and a number of other Allied cities in 1944-45. So, the other things that you notice here, there's, as you've seen in the pictures, I guess we go back to an image of the place. There's a large, there's a tower for seeing into Dulles Airport, observing airport operations, as well as some information about airport operations. There is an IMAX theater, Airbus IMAX theater. So it is in many ways a full museum. The Boeing Aviation Hangar, this is a view essentially on the civil aviation direction with the 367-80, the prototype of the Boeing 707 on the left, and you sort of see the red, white, and blue Air France tail of the Concorde in the background, and a Junkers Ju-52, German World War II era airliner, although actually I think this one was built by the Spanish, and many of the aerobatic and sport airplanes we have in the hangar. There's a direction view in the other direction with the Grumman F6F World War II Navy fighter in the foreground, and underneath it you see the Enola Gay there, and looking off to the right into this area, largely the World War II section of the hangar. But if you go down to the far right in this picture, you get into the Cold War and post-Cold War sections with the jets and so forth. In the back of the Enola Gay there's a German World War II section where we have a number of very rare, one of a kind. It's sort of a company also, and I'm going to talk in a minute about the German World War II missiles that we have in the space hangar. So this is looking into the space hangar here with the sections with the shuttle in the middle. As I said, since 2012, Discovery has replaced Enterprise at the center of this thing. This is an overview of the hangar. So if you're coming in at the right here, and you're looking to the right, that's the rockets and missiles section, and in the left is the human spaceflight section, and in the far back are application satellites and space science, which I'm going to talk a little bit about later on. So we're going to essentially go on a tour roughly, or in the circle, in a counterclockwise circle around the shuttle, to talk about the different parts of the hangar and some of the things that are there. the Space Shuttle Discovery is the most storied, the most experienced of the surviving shuttles. Of course, two orbiters were lost, and coincidentally, they were the two oldest orbiters for Challenger, and then the oldest orbiter, Columbia, in the two shuttle accidents. And so the Discovery is the third shuttle, the third spaceflight qualified shuttle orbiter. Flew 39 missions, significantly more than the other two survivors, Atlantis and Endeavour. When we brought it in, I mean, I was immediately struck about it's just a more interesting artifact because you go around it, you see the scorching, you see the actual wear and tear on the shuttle from re-entering 39 times. So it's certainly very interesting thing to look at and experience to look at it. This orbiter flew some of the most historic missions. So it launched the Hubble Space Telescope in 1990. It was the orbiter that was used on both return to flight missions after the two accidents in 1986 and 2003. A year and a half, 2 years later, it flew the first mission in both cases. The first woman pilot on a space shuttle, Eileen Collins, flew a mission was on the first mission to actually rendezvous with the Russian Mir space station. So it flew a number of Mir space station missions in the middle 90s. It flew John Glenn, Senator John Glenn in 1998 on his shuttle mission, and then participated in a lot of ISS, the International Space Station, assembly missions in the 2000s, after the year 2000, and lifting many major modules to the International Space Station. So when we requested a shuttle, we always had Discovery in mind, given that the Columbia had been lost in 2003. As I said, on the right, as you go in, so as you walk into the hangar there on the right, immediately you see the rockets and missiles section. This is actually a little older picture because you'll notice in other things that the blue Regulus that's to the right of the exhibit is actually now was later erected on a particular launch stand that we had. But each kind of section in Udvar Hazy has a small sort of overview exhibit and an exhibit case. This kind of provides some context. I mean, I'd have to say that the downtown and the Hazy museums are rather different. So the Hazy is really more like a traditional air museum, which is hangars full of planes and spacecraft and stuff, with some labeling. The downtown museum is the fuller museum, where we have full complex exhibits that we do about this, and that's where you want to go if you want to do a deep dive. I think Udvar Hazy is best for the person or a person leading a group who is already knowledgeable about air and space, because there's a whole lot of stuff and each object has a label, but you have to bring your own knowledge and your own context when you look at this material, because we don't have the place to have an elaborate exhibit about every artifact. We simply have it there, and we have some explanatory material on these label panels that you see around the exhibits. One of the things you'll find both in that case that the man is standing in front of here, and in other parts of the hangar, there's a significant number of artifacts from the American rocket pioneer Robert Goddard. So Goddard, as many of you will know, launched the first liquid propellant rocket in March 1926. And although it's a little hard to see in this picture on the right there, you see kind of a triangular black stand. that is holding a model of the March 1926 rocket. The mock-up, the original, does not exist, although part of that rocket exists in a May 1926 rocket, which will come back to the downtown museum, and when that section reopens in middle of 2024. And then you see, kind of in the dead middle of this picture, you see the silver P series rocket. This is effectively the last major rocket that Robert Goddard made in Roswell, New Mexico. He tried to launch it in 1940 and 41. He didn't have that much luck with it. It turned out to be really too big and complicated, but it is you don't really get from this picture the fact that it's nearly 20 feet tall. So he'd come a long ways in terms of experimentation, but you find elsewhere, like in that rocket and missiles exhibit station case you see here above the liquid oxygen container. This is all unwrapped, so it's like a thermos bottle for, he took liquid oxygen was supplied by a local liquid air company to fuel his rockets, and this shows essentially the small scale that he was working on, especially at the beginning. And then it was wrapped in felt, and all of this is unwrapped. And then there's like a carrier for that bottle, is basically just a wooden thing with the handles that was used to carry the liquid oxygen bottle, and then the liquid oxygen would be poured into the tank of the small rocket. Below, you also have an engine with part of the combustion chamber cut away, sort of an early Goddard rocket engine. So Robert Goddard, who the Smithsonian began supporting in 1917, was a inventor of the liquid propellant rocket, and certainly influenced a lot of people to think that spaceflight was possible. If you go to the downtown museum now, as you enter, you see another Goddard rocket, the 1929 so-called hoop skirt rocket, and right in the entrance area, and when the more parts of the museum are open in the future, you'll find other Goddard artifacts coming in the future. So we have an extremely good collection. Smithsonian has, because of its long relationship with Goddard, a very good collection of Goddard objects. In the corner of the rocket and missile section, you find something, and this is particularly my area of interest since I've written a lot about German rocket development. German rockets and missiles in the space hangar. We've had the V1 and V2 missiles downtown for years now. Of course, they're both actually in the restoration hangar at Hazy because they're both being restored and repainted to come back to the downtown museum. But at the Udvar Hazy Center, if you go off in the corner, you see anti-aircraft missiles like the Rheintochter on the upper left, the Schmetterling on the upper right. You see a couple of guided bombs, early precision guided weapons here on the middle left, the X4, the Fritz X1, the X1, Fritz X, and the HS-293. They were both, the top is a precision guided bomb, the bottom was a rocket assisted glide bomb, is used mostly against shipping. You have other bottom middle, you have two little air-to-air missiles. Of course, the thing notable about this German World War II missile development was they had a lot of amazing things. Very little of it worked. Very little of it had any effect on the war. And who benefited from it? Basically us. In the lower right, you have this cutaway of the V2 engine. And so the V2 was used against targets in Western Europe, as I mentioned earlier. Over 3,000, about 3,000 were fired, and yet the war was not materially affected by that. Who benefited from it? The United States, the Soviet Union, France, Britain got the technology. Often they got the people who worked on the German rocket program. And so in many ways, it did not benefit the Nazis at all, fortunately, but it benefited the Allied powers who grabbed up all of this material at the end of the war. There are a number of cruise missiles in the building. On the upper right, the Loon is actually an American copy of the V1. It was at the entrance to the space hangar. Right now, it's down at the other end, and it's kind of in the Cold War section, because we've been using the entrance to show off objects that are going to come back to the downtown museum. Currently, the Bell X-1 that Chuck Yeager used to break the sound barriers in that spot. And as you go into the gallery, you have on the lower left in this slide, the Regulus you see now is in this image as it's erected on this launch stand. You have the Matador in the middle right, Air Force medium range nuclear missile. So at a time when it wasn't clear whether the ballistic missile, the rocket-based ballistic missile, would really be the answer to having long-range nuclear missiles, a lot of these air-breathing missiles were developed using jet engines of various kinds, turbojets, pulse jets, ramjets, to carry nuclear warheads. Later on, the cruise missiles largely become a tactical weapon. This is in the lower right, ALC, air launched cruise missile A. There's a B is hanging above it. You see in some pictures, is a tactical missile, either as with a nuclear warhead or for a standoff attack, or of course it's never been used that way. Fortunately, what we see is a lot of use in the Middle East, particularly in the wars where the U.S. has launched conventionally armed cruise missiles. We have a lot of early Army and Navy missiles, and there's a whole row on the back side of the rocket section. There's a whole row of these on the left. Navy experimental missiles started in 1943 and go into the early Cold War, into the 1950s, trying to develop the technologies. We have two standing up. We have the Corporal in the middle and the Redstone on the right in different parts of the hangar, showing this kind of early ballistic missile development as we get into the Cold War and the nuclear arms race. I would say from the standpoint of history, the nuclear arms race drives all this rocket development. It is the foundation for being able to go into space when the space race starts, because so much money has been spent because we are in a arms race with the Soviet Union. This is and of course that later on, those kind of Navy cruise missiles, like you see the blue Regulus in the background, are replaced by submarine launch ballistic missiles. This is a Poseidon submarine launch ballistic missile. And then in the middle, you see a different couple of angles, a 1990s Pegasus space air launched launch vehicle that Orbital Sciences built as a small satellite launcher. On the backside of the rocketry section, there is 1,000 years of rocketry case where there's a whole bunch of different artifacts from all kinds of different eras of rocket development here. And there are, including some applications like infantry applications. You sort of see in the very middle of this case, the German version of the bazooka, a shoulder-fired rocket-propelled grenade. There's some historic test stand artifacts from Rocketdyne's test stand in Santa Susana, north of Los Angeles, on the lower left of the case. So there are some in there. If you look into the case, there are some Goddard artifacts and some other things. There is a large case related to rockets models and memorabilia, including sort of in the upper middle there, you see some flying rocket kits. So I know an NAR relevant. We have actually a very good collection of model rockets and kits and things from G. Harry Stein, who was one of the founders of the modern model rocket hobby in the United States. And I think, in fact, there's great potential for creating another exhibit case in the future at Hazy with many of these model rockets that we have that could be incorporated into a case on the history of the model rocket hobby. And I think that's an idea should pursue in the future, perhaps with NAR cooperation. Also in the case, a number of desktop models created by manufacturers, NASA models of launch vehicles, Skylab and other things, as well as memorabilia from important space program leaders. So here's the diagram again. We've essentially come around on the top side of the shuttle, and in this upper right corner here is the so-called application satellite section, which is actually much more heterogeneous than that. And on the lower left, the space science section. So application satellites, that includes, as a sort of general class, that includes weather satellites, communication satellites, spy satellites, military and civilian applications. Of course, now communications are satellites and weather satellites, and all of these things really dominate our lives. And one of the point I made I wrote a short history of spaceflight called Spaceflight: A Concise History, which you can easily get from MIT Press. And one of the points I make there is that's the part of space that really affects your life. I mean, human spaceflight gets all the publicity. And some people seem to think that is the space program, and that's all that really matters. Whereas, in fact, 90% of the space program is not human spaceflight. It is all of these satellites in Earth orbit. And we've effectively annexed the area around the Earth out to the 24-hour orbit at 22,300 miles and turn that into a zone for servicing the Earth, whether it be weather, communications, missile early warning, reconnaissance of other countries' military activities, all of these other things that are going on. One of the objects in that section is the Agena B, which is an early Air Force rocket stage. It was also the foundation for the first U.S. Photo reconnaissance satellite, Corona. And this is the kind of configuration in which Corona flew, although this is not exactly the same, but it is the same kind of rocket stage. We also have a lot of computing related artifacts in this area, and consoles and computers that have been used in aerospace. And on the other side of the section, there's a whole lot of rocket models, large rocket models, essentially of launch vehicles, of modern launch vehicles, multinational, the Japanese, European, and American in this row of launch vehicle models. In the back of this photograph, you see the Sirius XM communication satellite that's actually not there anymore. It was taken downtown and incorporated in the new One World Connected Gallery that's part of the new renovation of the Air and Space Museum downtown that reopened on October the 14th. To the other side, you see the space science section. Dominating the space is the Space Lab module, constructed by the Europeans, flown on the space shuttle, so it's sized to fit inside the shuttle bay for astronaut conducted experiments inside the shuttle bay, as well as some of the other equipment related to that. Above you sort of hanging white thing with a little broad skirt to the right. That's the Skylab Apollo telescope mount, solar telescopes like that was mounted on the Skylab. Well, this is obviously a backup. And we have a number of other things. Notably, we have a model of the 1997 Mars Pathfinder and Sojourner rover that was landed on Mars in July 1997. And restarted Mars exploration effectively after the Viking missions in 1976. There was a long hiatus in Mars exploration until we started again with this spacecraft in 1997. And also in the satellite, there's also the satellite suite, which is hanging above. Largely, a lot of early space race satellites are there. Models or backups of spacecraft that were launched early in the space race. This is satellites. We call this not a satellite suite. We actually, when this was proposed, somebody called it the wind chimes because they were afraid that if we open the door for the shuttle behind it, they'll all go flying around in the wind. So colloquially inside the building in the museum, we often call it the wind chimes. And the stairwell on the left is a way to go up to the second floor and into the overlook to the Hazy space hangar. So the last major section, essentially as you go in to your left, and we're now coming around the other direction, is the human spaceflight section, which I guess which also includes the space shuttle. You look at it, you start from the far end near space science. There is the instrument unit from a Saturn V. So it's the brains of the guidance and control and computing part of the Saturn V launch vehicle. They're 22 feet in diameter. And underneath it is a model of the Saturn V, but a 148 model of Saturn V. But actually in the future, we hope to bring back a model that we once showed in the Apollo to the Moon Gallery downtown, the old Apollo to the Moon Gallery. It's Dave Giannakis' magnificent 134 scale model of the Saturn V, complete with the launch pad and launch tower. As you move down the human spaceflight section, you run into a spacecraft of including, this is a Mercury capsule, one of the only two which is essentially complete in the orbital configuration. It's actually got a name on it. You can sort of see the Freedom 7-2 on the upper top. Alan Shepard hoped to fly this spacecraft on a one-day mission in 1963, but NASA said Mercury had gone on long enough and ended it after Gordon Cooper's day-and-a-half long flight in May 1963. So it didn't actually get launched into space, which means it's intact. Next to it, well, actually, I should say between that and this, which is the Gemini paraglider test vehicle, TTV-1, tow test vehicle 1. Between those two, and I didn't include this because it's not permanently part of the hangar, but right now, at least for about one more year, you can see John Glenn's Friendship 7, in which he became the first American to orbit the Earth, and you can see Gemini 4, in which Ed White became the first American to walk in space in 1965. And they're sort of positioned there as storage, sort of open storage for them until they can go back to the downtown museum. They will be reinstalled in the Milestones of Flight Gallery in the center of the mall building, which we hope to open mid to late 2024. That will be the next phase of reopening the downtown museum. This vehicle was a test for the two-man Gemini, and the picture on the right makes it look like it's flying. It's actually been sort of cut out in a photograph, but hanging overhead of it is this inflatable wing. There was a hope that Gemini could be brought home to land on a runway, but the idea did not work out, and it was not actually used in any manned mission. But they did do tests at Edwards Air Force Base trying to landing a mock-up, a boilerplate of the Gemini capsule with the paraglider wing. And when you go next back towards the entrance to the building, back towards the human spaceflight section, you find this test Apollo test spacecraft. It was used for water training for the astronauts, but also notable on this are installed the actual flotation devices from the Apollo 11 mission, the first landing on the moon. So this kind of donut-like sausage thing is around the bottom of the spacecraft is a flotation device installed by the divers, and up top you have these balloons. So the Apollo spacecraft, when it splashes down, may flip over and land upside down, and then the astronauts are very uncomfortable hanging from their straps, inflate the balloons, and will flip it back upright, which is actually what happened on Apollo 11. And these are the actual flotation devices from the Apollo 11 spacecraft, which is now in the downtown museum, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute or so. And on the other side of the Apollo is the mobile quarantine facility number 1, MQF, in which the Apollo 11 astronauts lived for 36 hours after they returned to Earth in 1960 on July 24th, 1969. So I've had people ask me questions about this, thinking that somehow they stayed in there for weeks. No, actually, what this trailer did was it isolated them from the time that they got onto the aircraft carrier until they were put into a special laboratory. So in Apollo, they were concerned that the remote, and I mean very remote possibility of so-called moon germs, that some kind of contaminant, biological contaminant, would come back from the moon. I think nobody really thought that was true, but NASA didn't want to dismiss the idea out of hand. And so the whole idea was that the astronauts landed in the water and they were given these special biological containment garments to put on, and then they got in, and then they were sprayed down, and then they got in a helicopter and they were taken to the carrier, and then they walked in and they got into this Airstream trailer, which is actually is an Airstream trailer that's heavily modified. It has all this equipment on it. It's so that it has a kind of negative pressure. Air can come in, but nothing will go out. So it has this filtering system. And what happened was they got into the trailer. The trailer was on the deck of the carrier. The carrier sailed to Hawaii, and in Hawaii, the trailer was then the MQF was transferred to a Air Force aircraft, and they were flown to Houston, and then they went into the Lunar Receiving Lab in Houston and spent the rest of the 3 weeks isolation period in there, and the lunar samples were brought in there with them. They did this on 3 missions, Apollo 11, 12, and 14, 13 of them actually having landed on the moon. And after Apollo 14, they said, well, it isn't really necessary. There isn't anything living on the moon, so we just don't need to do that anymore. And so the last 3 landings, the ones you may recall that had lunar rovers, they did not have to go through this, I'm sure, somewhat confining and annoying quarantine process. Around the corner from that, you'll find a couple of pop culture artifacts. This is the mothership model from Close Encounters of the Third Time, Spielberg's movie of the mid-1970s, of the UFO and encountering aliens, UFOs. And so this is the mothership model. It actually has many sort of peculiar features on it. This is at an age of movie making where you just couldn't do everything with CGI. You actually had to have models to do many of these shots. And sort of adjacent nearby is another case full of pop culture items, ray guns, space Barbie, all kinds of different things that relate to American enthusiasm for space travel, going all the way back to the 1920s and 30s and into the present, up to the era of Star Trek and Star Wars. So I'm going to end here just by talking a bit about, as I said, I'm tacking on to this tour of Hazy, the fact that the downtown museum, as I mentioned, is being rebuilt. We call it revitalization and transformation. The revitalization is the building project funded by Congress. The transformation is the new exhibits, for which I have to say, we're still fundraising if you have any interest in contributing. On the far left, this is a fairly recent photo, because on the far left you see the sections that have already been, all the external stone had to be taken off. It was found that they needed to be replaced, as well as all the interior systems. So it really amounted to a gutting of the building and rebuilding of the building. And on October 14th, we reopened the building for the 8 new galleries that are in the left part of this building image are now accessible. And I should note that you need to have time tickets to do that in order to get in. We are having essentially a crowd control, because we only have maybe 45% of the floor space of the building actually open. But they're free. They just have to go on the website and look for them. And it's usually not hard to get them unless you're looking at very peak times like major holidays and weekends. There tend to be not really much of a problem getting in. There are also some same day tickets, and and even some and when if it's not really crowded, then walk up tickets are available as well. And I'm going to end simply by, I have a naked commercial for my gallery that I led out of the 8, and that's called Destination Moon. It is a gallery about the whole history of lunar exploration, from ancient dreams to the missions happening today. The core of that gallery is the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo story, the race to the moon, how essentially why we decided to go to the moon, why the United States decided to go to the moon, what happened there, the space race with the Soviet Union. This is an illustration. I think if we're going to talk about rockets, rocketry, and rocket power, this is an amazing experience in this gallery. The F1 rocket engine, the huge 1.5 million pound thrust liquid propellant engine, the 5 of which were on the first stage of the Saturn V. This F1 is hanging from the ceiling. It used to be on its side in the old Apollo Moon Gallery, and there's a quarter of an engine in the corner and 2 mirrored surfaces there, and you can get the illusion of seeing 4, in some positions, even all 5 engines at the bottom of the Saturn V. So, and adjacent to that, just down to the left, on the edge of the bottom left of this picture, you see a bit of the pieces of an F1 engine from the Apollo 11 vehicle that were recovered from the ocean floor by Jeff Bezos. And so there are basically pieces of the head of the engine. If you look at that reflection on the left, the pieces around the head of the engine were the only thing that survived the rocket stage crashing into the ocean. And I will end here with the Apollo 11 Command Module Columbia. So we looked, which is now in the Downtown Museum, is a spin-off from this exhibit. I and fellow curators also did the national tour, so some of you may have seen that. It went to Houston, St. Louis, Pittsburgh, Seattle, and Cincinnati between October 2017 and February 2020, and toured the country with an exhibit, essentially a preview of parts of Destination Moon. It was about the Apollo 11, the first landing on the moon. And not far to the right of this picture, there is Neil Armstrong's spacesuit that he used to become the first human to land on the moon. So if you do get a chance to come to Washington, you may want to not just go to the Hazy Center. You may also want to try to come into the downtown, because in addition to this gallery, there is the One World Connected I mentioned once, which is about the Earth. We have the Planets Gallery, the new version of the Planets Gallery, the new version of the Wright Brothers Gallery, new Early Flight Gallery, We All Fly, which is about general aviation, and a gallery called Nation of Speed, which looks at the American obsession with speed, and it includes race cars, rocket sleds, rocket engines, aircraft engines, and so forth. All about a fascination with speed. So that's a gallery that has many objects, also include cars from the Museum of American History. So that's what I have to say about the about this, and I was happy to take some questions here. Let me just turn off the sharing here, and I can go to the Q&A section if anyone would like to add questions here. I see a few coming up already here on the right. Let me give me a second here and get a drink of water.
Doctor, before you start the questions, if you could make sure to read the question first
for
everyone before answering it. Thank you.
And I wanted to mention, we also had created recently communications had created a video fly through of the Udvar Hazy Center. So if you have any interest in that, I think it's been posted in the chat, already. It's essentially a drone fly through that we recently did. It's like a minute and a half or 2 minute video. You want to get a sense of that. Sorry about this. Turn off the message machine here. Question number one: is there a classroom and makerspace of deep dive in shuttle technology? Not specifically on shuttle. There are classrooms because we have education spaces when they're used as an education space for classes, mostly from Northern Virginia, although some from farther distance coming. We do have some shuttle tiles in the case on human spaceflight cave and some discussions of that, but we don't have a makerspace or anything as ambitious as that in this. In the future, the question will be, what is in the downtown building and what will be done there, because we got a donation from Jeff Bezos, which includes the funding of Bezos Education Center, and that will be attached to the Mall Museum and will be open probably more like 2027. We have to build it and we're finishing the downtown museum by 2025. And by the end of 2025, we hope, certainly no later than the 50th anniversary of the building in July 2026. And then there is, and then the Bezos Learning Center will be constructed, will be finishing at that time. Next question: the Far Side rocket found in this gallery, it's in the space hangar, is the Holy Government. Now, does the museum holding dimensional drawings of this artifact used to construct an accurate flying model? I don't know the answer to that question, but if you put in an inquiry to the the NASA archives, you can go on the website and insert a public inquiry into our website about that specific question. So the NASA archives is actually at the Udvar Hazy Center. It's sort of adjacent to, it's on the second floor, adjacent to the overlook to the restoration hangar. You can't go there without having a prearranged visit. You can't. The door is not open. But if there are dimensional the drawings of Farsight, and we have a lot of drawing sets, that would be the place to ask. Do you think we'll ever house an old Starship prototype? I'm not quite sure what you mean by that. There is a. You mean if by Starship you mean the SpaceX Starship? Yeah, eventually we would like to have something like that. Obviously, we have a challenge, I think, in this commercial spaceflight era. When we got our objects from NASA, and the services, or most of them, at least in the space side, we do. We have to ask the commercial space companies to give us things, and it's really up to them whether they want to give us anything or not. I was as a rocket curator and also acting over the whole collection. I worked with Blue Origin, SpaceX, Rocket Lab, and we have acquired some smaller sort of engine-size objects. And one vehicle, as we'll announce soon. But Starship is going to be an interesting challenge because it's so large. I think we're going to need another space hangar in the future. I think we're going to have to add another one of equivalent size. It's so because it's a big artifact, a big spacecraft. Next question. Do you know if Dr. Von Braun actually used a Martin space rules as claimed by the U.S. Space and you probably mean the U.S. Space and Rocket Center and their reconstruction of Von Braun's office. Whatever they took from their office, from that office, was actually in Von Braun's office. So it is possible that he had it. Whether he used it, I would, even though I wrote a biography, I have no idea whether he used it or not. In the downtown museum, in the exhibit that's now been closed and called Space Race, we showed a German slide rule that von Braun used, had brought or bought from Germany. But good question as to whether he actually used this. I don't know if I could answer it. Another question for Will Marchand. In professional aerospace, there's a distinction between solid rocket motors and liquid propellant engines. You comment when and where this distinction came into place? Well, yeah, I mean, it would take an examination of the history of English and how it's used, but I gather that really came into use in the 40s and 50s as large solid rocket motors were developed. I think the distinction is clearly that the idea that the solid rocket motor does not have moving parts or does not have many moving parts. It's not a complicated object, so it's called a motor rather than an engine. And I would guess that became kind of term of art in the aerospace, in the engineering industry in the 1950s, would be my guess. Are there expand the Udvar Hazy Museum even further? Well, we would like to. It's kind of a long run plan. We are expanding the storage related to Udvar Hazy. So one of the parts of this reconstruction of the Mall Museum was we got the Congress to fund a new extra large storage building next to Hazy called the Dulles Collection Center 1. And in the future, we are planning now to build more of these collection center buildings, but they are not public buildings. It is possible, I think, if I understand this correctly, that to build out the ends of the aviation hangar. And times have been talk about, as I mentioned, about the idea of having a future space hangar. We are going to need to do something in the long run, but because effectively we're already full. A lot of our collection is on loan, as you know. Many of you run into rockets and missiles and the spacecraft at NASA visitor centers and elsewhere on loan from us. But even so, all our storage is pretty much full. All of our exhibit spaces are pretty much full, and we do need more. We'll need more space in the future. So I think we're talking 2030s and onwards, because first we have to get through the downtown museum reconstruction. The V2 in the Museum of the Air is unrecognizable at the time. Was at the Ordnance Museum at APG, at Aberdeen Proving Ground. What service changes in NASA and V2 are expected on slave rebel routes for planning and parent? Thank you. A very good question. Obviously, right in my area of personal interest. The Air Force Museum took the one that had been in Aberdeen from the Army, which the Army never had the resources to protect it properly, so it was incredibly rusted out. And they turned it into, they basically reskinned the whole thing and put a paint scheme on it that was not with the old paint scheme. This is not the flaw. That's certainly one way to restore. So I don't want to sort of sound like I'm just being critical, but it's not our philosophy of restoration. Our philosophy of restoration is to be as responsible to the original artifact as we can. And that's why, as the curator of the V2, I decided some years ago that I wanted to get rid of the black and white paint scheme. We put that on in 1976. Sort of looks like the 3rd of October 1942 rocket that was the first V2 to successfully go a significant distance. That was in many ways an attempt to make it into a space artifact. And the missile that we have, which is, as we've discovered in the process of doing this major restoration, even more so, I mean, we knew that, but even more so, it reinforces the fact that it is very much a composite. It's got pieces from several different rockets. It is not one rocket. We have been able to establish that it is the rocket that was shown at Freeman Field, Indiana, by the Army Air Forces in September 1945. And that rocket then went to a storage, Air Force storage at Park Ridge, Illinois, which actually became O'Hare Airport, and then was given to the Smithsonian in 1949 and shipped to us in the 1950s. But it's already a composite from the time that we got that we got it. So it's apparent that the Air Force, probably Army Air Forces as it then was, may have put it together out of parts of different rockets, or they had one rocket in which they replaced parts, because we found that there are two halves of the central fuselage shell are from different times. I have certainly emphasized in all that I have written in my book, The Rocket and the Reich, and Von Braun and elsewhere, that we do not forget the concentration camp story. In fact, the concentration camp story is going to be mentioned in the area, the exhibitry around the V2 when it goes back to the museum and is unveiled in 2025. We also have the V1 in the new World War II gallery. So there'll be a new World War II gallery opening on the east end of the building in 2025. And it will have a special section on concentration camp labor, including artifacts on loan from the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp memorial. So I have pretty much emphasized that. We did not find markings on our rocket like that were found on the tanks, at least one tank of the Air Force Museum rocket. But we are putting it into a green camouflage that accurately represents what most of the rocket came from late war manufacture, very last months of the war. And the very last months of the war, the V2 was put in a plain green camouflage. They got away from, as things got more desperate, they got away from more complicated schemes and just painted them basically in a camouflage green with markings. And that's what we are going to do. So it's a very appropriate question. Yeah, and I think there's the far side question again. As a fellow native of Alberta, Canada, alumni of the University of Calgary, I'm interested in your pathway to NASA. Were you a space rocketry enthusiast to taking that position? Had any experience in the model rocketry in your past? Yeah, very good question. So yes, I went to the University of Calgary. Then I ended up becoming an historian. I thought I started out wanting to be an aerospace. Then I tried being an astronomer, and apparently I was much better at writing than I was at being a scientist or an engineer. So I ended up doing German history and becoming a German historian, PhD at Johns Hopkins. And I had left the space. I was a space buff. So I grew up in the 60s. I was 10 years old or near 10 when Yuri Gagarin and Alan Shepard flew. So I was infected with the space enthusiasm of the 60s. So I was very much of a space buff at that time. I did have some experience with model rocketry in the later 60s. In Canada, it was so regulated and so bureaucratic. We had to go through this whole process just to be able to import rockets. You had to have an adult and who had to take a test, and it was very bureaucratic. But so the model rocket hobby sort of started late in Canada. The stuff was available from Estes and others in the U.S. I was involved in some model rocket launching in 68, 69. I came back to the space in the 80s after I finished my PhD, and I was looking for a new topic. Had been working on the labor history of the 19th century, early 20th century, and I started thinking about writing about the sort of rocket groups in Germany in the 1930s, 20s, and 30s, and Von Braun. And that whole, I sort of started on that course of that research, started in the mid to late 80s. I got a fellowship at the Air and Space Museum in 88, and then another fellowship. And then I was fortunate enough to get a job in 1990 at the Air and Space Museum. Was Goddard Nell hypergolic? No, Nell was, I should mention for everybody that Nell was kind of his nickname for every rocket he had. So he only used liquid oxygen and gasoline. Those were his propellants. That he stuck to that throughout this whole time. He did not experiment. Hypergolics are self-igniting propellants, are obviously usually with chemicals that are toxic and difficult to deal with. And hypergolic experiments really started in Germany in World War II, in the United States in World War II, in the Soviet Union as well. So by larger groups, when they started looking for different rocket combinations, different rocket propellant combinations, because, I mean, you have this problem. Liquid oxygen is not the most practical propellant for a military rocket. It boils off, you lose some of it, it has to be, you have to fuel at the last minute, and all those disadvantages. Even though the Germans did it, they operationally deployed the V2 using liquid oxygen. And so did the United States in its early Cold War ballistic missiles. But it's not very convenient, and that's when the experiments on hypergolics started in World War II. How much of Discovery's interior and the information preserved? It is very complete. We try to emphasize to NASA to not strip it out. The one thing that got stripped out, which we had no control, was they said everything apropos of hypergolics, everything relating to the reaction control systems, the orbital maneuvering system, all those rocket engines, all the lines touched by hypergolic propellants. NASA said we can't guarantee safety with those. They all have to be stripped out. The engine bells on the rocket are just engine bells. There are no engines behind that firewall on Discovery, because they kept all the space shuttle main engine components. In fact, they're reusing them on the SLS. In fact, the Artemis 1 launch, they were four engines on the core stage were all refurbished from shuttle flown components. What kind of restoration had to be done to Discovery before it could be brought in? Do any restoration to it. It came from NASA. NASA's job at the end of the shuttle program, and Congress allocated the money, was to make the vehicles safe for public display, notably taking out everything that was potentially dangerous. And so components are taken out. I mean, the earlier question about the interior, the cockpit, is very complete. I mean, almost nobody gets to go in there. I mean, it's a historic artifact. We can't have people sort of walking through it. There's really no practical way to have access to it other than to create a three-dimensional model of it and be able to put that online or in an interactive. But it is very complete. We didn't have to do anything. Basically, it landed on the shuttle carrier aircraft in 2012. It took a couple of days, and they took it off. They towed it into the hangar, and after we pulled the Enterprise out, and we rolled it in and closed it up. We've had a little maintenance that we do over the years. There's some oil leakages and other things that we have to deal with. So we have people experience with the shuttle. NASA people who are experienced with the shuttle every year or so would come in and maybe do a little checking and maintenance. The V2 currently on a restoration will return to the mall. It will return to the mall, yes. So it'll return to the same gallery space that it was in before. That is the sort of Gallery 114, what you call it Space Hall. The new version of the exhibit in that space will be called Living in the Space Age. If you could answer at the end, you could answer during the presentation. The Far Side was donated to the Smithsonian in 1965 by Ford. Was it kept there until it was exhibited in the Udvar McDonnell Space Hangar? Did it require restoration? I don't think it was much restored at all. I suspect, but what I don't know offhand is whether we ever showed it before. It's possible that it was in an earlier exhibit in the Downtown Museum in the 70s, but I'd have to go looking it up to see whether there is any history of the artifact. I mean, if you write me at neufeldm@si.edu, I can go look into the artifact record and see if I can tell if the far side was ever displayed before. So yeah, I guess I just don't know the answer. So I have reached the end of the questions. So if there are no more questions to be had, we can stop. Oh, here's one popped up. That is the same one. If we have exhausted the questions, I appreciate very much your attention, and I hope you come and visit the Air and Space Museum, both at the excuse me, getting a dry throat, the Hazy Center, and in the downtown museum, as it's now open and is now opening up, and will open up it will continue to open in phases from 2020 from 2024 and 2025. More parts of the museum will also be available then. So thank you very much for your attention, and have a good night. Bye.